Russian President Vladimir Putin gave his first address to the nation since this weekend's short-lived armed rebellion attempt. He says steps were immediately taken to, quote, neutralize the threat and avoid a lot of bloodshed. Putin labeled the organizers of the rebellion as traitors to their country and people. Joining us now from Kyiv is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Colonel, thanks so much for joining us. Let's talk about Putin's address to the nation yesterday and this morning. I mean, the headlines are all across the West. Putin seems weakened by what transpired over this weekend. But is he really?
He is. Thanks for having me on, Vlad and Anne-Marie. From my standpoint, when this war first started, I said this was going to be the beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin. I think if I was looking for indicators, tipping points where Vladimir Putin looks significantly weaker today than he did this time last week, this was one of them. A member of his elites launched an armed insurrection. I mean, he actually meant to do it as a demonstration. He meant to do this to protest against the fact that he was losing control. Prigozhin was losing control of this private military corporation. It was going to get folded back into the Ministry of Defense. But what ended up happening is he achieved catastrophic success. He secured the Southern Military District headquarters, several different cities, and really the only reason he was stopped is because he lost his will. He kind of buckled at the last minute. He didn't want to create bloodshed because that wasn't his plan all along. He was just trying to force a change in military leadership. Ultimately, what that did, though, is it showed that Putin was weak. He did not have the military means to resist this armed insurrection. He only did that because of, frankly, fortune in certain regards, bringing other forces to bear to pressure Prigozhin to back down. And when his own population sees this and looks at this, they now see an individual that's being challenged from within, from his own elites, a individual that is going to really great lengths. He's been off the air largely, appearing very infrequently, but over the past 36 hours or so, he's appeared 4 times, offering contradictory statements. First damning Prigozhin, then offering him kind of a deal, a sweet deal where he goes to Belarus, and then damning him again. But Prigozhin's still not in custody. So where does that leave Vladimir Putin? It looks like he's weak. He's weaker than he was certainly before these events unfolded. And I think this is going to start to chip away at his support and the perception that he's immune to attack. He's immune to kind of any kinds of criticism. I think this has accelerated his undoing.
So now we have a break, though, in a very valuable relationship between Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin and the Wagner Group. This is a private military, trained mercenaries, and at least the messaging that we're getting is that they're much more professional fighters than the Russian military is, which more ragtag, if you will. But now there's a break. And Vladimir Putin says that he's going to be absorbing anyone who wants to be absorbed from the Wagner Group into the regular military, which I think would be a pretty substantial clash of cultures. So I don't know how those two groups are going to work together. But my question to you is, without the support of the Wagner Group, what are the military capabilities of the Russian military now?
The Russian military really relies on mass, large force, access to enormous amounts of firepower. That's artillery and artillery stockpiles, old and new kind of armor and infantry fighting vehicles, planes. So it was the mass that allows Russia to kind of have early successes and kind of weather the Ukrainian counteroffensive at the moment. Wagner was a key component in that they were kind of shock troops. They were thrown into the hardest portions of fighting. They delivered a small victory around the city of Bakhmut. They're out of the fight. The Russian military is less capable. What's interesting is that there's now reporting that the National Guard of Russia is going to receive heavy weapons, whether that's Wagner's heavy weapons or the Russian military's heavy weapons. What that means is fundamentally stealing from the military that was fighting the war in Ukraine and delivering those capabilities to the National Guard so they could defend the country against other armed insurrection. That is a pretty telling kind of series of events that the National Guard, which was really paramilitary anti-riot police, is now going to be armed with heavy weapons to secure the country. That is another sign that the country is weaker. Around the world, people are looking at the scenario and wondering what's going to happen, whether Putin's going to be able to hang on, even if he does manage to turn the corner and kind of reestablish his hold, it has not changed the fundamental kind of principle that Putin is going to be undone by this war sooner or later. Now sooner, he's going to find himself out of the presidency, and who knows where else.
So, Colonel, let me ask you back to your earlier point. I saw that you tweeted earlier something similar to this, that because of these contradictory statements that he's given in the last 24 hours or so, it's meant to bolster public perception. But how much of Putin's power is really invested in him by the public, and more so the oligarchs who he is meant to protect, right? The idea being that Vladimir Putin is in power because these oligarchs are benefiting from him being there in power. He protects them, and because of that protection, they don't foment a rebellion against him, right? The word is that maybe he doesn't run for re-election in the spring. Is that really what we're talking about when we say that he has no support, that he just won't run again for the presidency, or are we talking about something else?
You know, that's a very interesting point. He doesn't really rely on the support of the population. The reason is that there's kind of an implicit deal with the population really throughout the entirety of Putinism, where they gain some prosperity. There's a stability associated with Putin's regime. In exchange, the population largely is disengaged from politics, and elites run the country as they will. What I think that whole bargain has crumbled, frankly, since the beginning of the war. It's now, increasingly looking. The stability has been shattered through these attacks on cities. Whether those attacks led to a lot of bloodshed or not doesn't really make a difference. They were fundamentally attacked and out of the control of the federal government, out of the control of the Kremlin for a brief moment. So that bargain is broken. It looked like Prigozhin's, kind of a little short-term coup received some public support. So the support for Putin looks also quite fragile. And for the elites that are really concerned about their own well-being, preserving the system, they're now wondering if Putin is the person to deliver the security. Of course, he's the most powerful individual in the system. There is no kind of one, two, or even group of elites that are going to challenge him. But as a whole, that group is now wondering if he's the security that he was guaranteed, that was promised, or do they need to look somewhere else and look for an opportunity to be able to latch onto somebody else? Prigozhin is the first, but very well may not be the last person to challenge Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin just happened to have a large force that was, frankly, even though it was under the Ministry of Defense, received funds from the Ministry of Defense, was more had a lot more kind of command and control autonomy from the rest of the military. But it's not the end. I mean, these significant losses, hundreds of thousands of troops killed and wounded, are going to have an impact. And, how long does it take before we see a 1917 type of revolution where people will throw down, the military throws down their weapons, kind of walks off the battlefield? It's not as far-fetched an idea as it was a week ago. I think we could start seeing, increasing kind of chips in this perception that Putin is a strong man holding the country together. And this was inevitable in a disastrous war where Russia's suffering these kinds of losses, really with nothing to show for it.
Alexander Vindman, great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.